Hashem is Yudke Vovke. This is the name which is unpronounceable. You pronounce it not as it's written, because the Torah alludes when God says, Shmi L'Olam, my name is forever, but the word L'Olam is written in a deficient form, La'alem, that the name, the pronunciation should be concealed. In this last reading, we read that the only location that you were permitted to pronounce the name in its full spelling was only in the location of the divine presence. It was either in the Mishkan or in the Beis HaMikdash. When the Kohanim, when they would bless the Jewish people, they wouldn't pronounce Yud-Kei Vav-Kei as Avni as we do, but rather with its full pronunciation. God is infinite. What is the meaning infinite? He was, Hoya Hoveviyah. God was, isn't in the future. It doesn't mean God existed in the past, and he exists presently, and he will be in the future. But rather, God is in the future. Because if God himself is infinite, infinite means there's no beginning, there's no end. It's something that any creation, which is finite, cannot fathom. Because how could you be in the future if the future hasn't yet existed? But God is already in the future. The past has already taken place. God is still in the past. Because if the past no longer exists, that means God is contained within a finite context. So God is present, past, present, and future. So it's not God knows the future. God is aware of our actions in the future. He's aware, because it already happened. How could it have happened? We're not there yet. It's something which a human being cannot. The Rambam says this is something that no one will ever understand. Only God himself understands it, because God is infinite. Now, we speak about certain events that take place. God has an objective. The world has to achieve a level of perfection. Avram made a mistake. He asked the question. Because he asked that question, God says, your children will be in a land which is not theirs, strange land which is not theirs. They will be enslaved, they will be afflicted, and they will have great wealth. It turned out to be Egypt. This was the 210 years we spent in Egypt. The great wealth was the wealth we took from Egypt. As we read, we borrowed gold and silver vessels, all their personal valuables, and then we left. They pursued us into the sea, and all their personal wealth was taken, but the government wealth, that wealth, they covered and bedecked the chariots with gold and diamonds and jewels, and that was thrown onto the sea. We spoke about the spoils of the sea. Those spoils were used to build the Mishkan. Needed an enormous amount of wealth for that. So the wealth they took out of Egypt, that was their personal wealth. The spoils of the sea, those spoils were used for the building of the Mishkan. Why did we need a Mishkan? Because the Jews sinned with the golden calf. If the Jews wouldn't have sinned with a golden calf, there wouldn't have been need for a Mishkan. Mishkan says, you build for me this medium, that through that medium I will dwell in your midst. If not for the sin of the golden calf, God would have dwelt directly in our midst. We wouldn't have needed the medium of the Mishkan. So all this wealth for the Mishkan, that level of wealth wouldn't be needed. If that's the case, all the gems and the gold that the chariots were bedecked with, the spoils of the sea wouldn't have been necessary. So the spoils of the sea were necessary because God, knowing the future that the Jews will sin with the golden calf after giving the Torah at Sinai, there will be the need for a Mishkan. The Mishkan will need this enormous amount of wealth. And God didn't want us, as I explained in the past, that when he tells us, build for me the sanctuary, should I dwell in your midst? Because if there's any level of hesitation, that itself will be actually a reason why it should not happen. So immediately, as he said, build for me, we immediately, within a day, all the materials were there. So only because God knows the future, is in the future, therefore, as a result of that, he orchestrates events in advance to address the future. I'll give you an example. we're not too far from Purim. Haman was the personification of Amalek. He wanted to annihilate every man, woman, and child from the face of the earth. Achashverosh ruled the world supreme. There wasn't a province in existence was not under his dominance. And he was able to what? To extract, because he was the viceroy of the Persian Empire, from Achashverosh to be agreeable to issue this decree: every man, woman, and child, Jewish, should be annihilated. Now, was he able to extract this from the king? So there's a whole dialogue which the Talmud discusses, where he paid, and it says explicitly in the Megillah that we read on Purim, 10,000 talents of silver, or bullion. He had given to Achashverosh. When he gave him that amount of money, of wealth, he took off his ring and gave it to him. He says, you could seal their faith. Now, we're going to read in 2 weeks, we read the portion of Kisiso. Kisiso speaks about the giving of the half silver coin, what we call the machzah shekel. So it was silver. Every male above the age of 20 has to give the machzah shekel for the purchase of communal offerings. Because communal offerings, every Jew had a share in the communal offering. Every Jew contributed to that. So that was silver. Whenever God brings a problem on the Jewish people, he's always magdim refulah makkah. He always gives the remedy, puts the remedy in place before actually the problem happens. Why? Because if we would not have that remedy in advance, we can't deal with the problem later. So because knowing what Haman would do, that he himself gave 10,000 bullion to seal the fate of the Jews, God literally 1,000 years earlier, more than that, had given us a mitzvah that we should give a matzah shekel, that every male Jew above the age of 20 should give a certain amount of silver for the communal offerings in the temple or in the Mishkan. Those silver coins which every Jew gave offset the 10,000 bullion that Haman had given to seal the fate of the Jews. And because that was in place, therefore, it was totally ineffective. That was the merit that we had prior to the prosecution. God always has that card that he pulls out of his bag. Satan comes and prosecutes. The Jews deserve to be destroyed. The Amalekites are rearing their heads, and we're going to be, God forbid, under the boot. Amalekites is the personification of evil, the descendants of Esav, of Edom. God says, but you forgot one thing. The Jews have a special merit. The merit of that silver coin that they give every year to purchase the communal offerings, that will offset and negate whatever the level of wealth that Haman, the viceroy of the Persian Empire, gave. It's always this way. Now, Egypt, as we discuss, has a representation of evil. Who's going to expunge that evil from the world? They have to be expunged, because that's what they are. The only people that could expunge that, could extract that, and purge that from existence, and literally vaporize it, are only the Jewish people. If you read every morning in the Shachar service, we read, Atu Hashem Elokim asher bacharta b'Avrom. You are God who chose Avrom. V'otzeisam you were Kazdim. You took him out of the kiln of Kazdim. And you found his heart faithful to you. And what do we say right afterwards? Avram withstood this test of fire. He was given an ultimatum. Either you bow to the idol or you go into the kiln. This is after, because Avram was espousing monotheism. Still, it wasn't enough that he should be the founding father of the Jewish people, who would be the representation of good in existence, to negate all the evil in existence, that his descendants will be the counterforce to all evil that will ever exist till the end of time. Why was he chosen to be the founding father of the nation that will be the representation of good, which will be the counterforce to evil? Because God chose Avram, because he went into the kiln, he's willing to die for God. It's not only he believed in God, he was willing to give it all up, to give his life. Miraculously came out of fire and kiln. And that was and you found his heart faithful to you. The paragraph we say immediately after that, what do we say? God entered into a covenant with Avram. They gave him the lands, all the lands of Canaan. And what did they represent? The 7 nations of Canaan, what did they represent? Besides the evil which Egypt represented, they represented another level of evil. Because there was a mitzvah when we went into Canaan to actually destroy the nations of Canaan. That was a commandment. Because they were another level of representation of evil. They had to be destroyed. But why was Avram given the task to destroy this evil? Why? First it was Egypt, and then it was the nations of Canaan. And after the splitting of the sea, what happens? We're attacked by the Amalekites. God says, my throne is not complete until you eradicate the Amalekites from under the heavens. Whose responsibility is that? Upon who is that incumbent? Who has that obligation? The Jewish people. Why? Because since Avram, the founding father of the Jewish people, had proven that his heart is faithful to God, he himself is the foundation. He's the bedrock of the Jewish people, that from him emanates this representation of good. And it even became better because his grandson Yaakov was the most special of the patriarchs who fathered the Jewish people. This is the understanding. So therefore, things are not happenstance. Avram, that he asked that question, God knew he would fail. But God wanted him, put that before him, because he knew he would ask the question, and therefore we're destined to go to Egypt. Because otherwise, who's going to deal with the Egyptians? Because they chose to create an entity of evil which only Avram's descendants could destroy. So therefore, but God can't take an innocent people and put them into bondage to address an issue. So we have to be at fault. There has to be something that has to be corrected. Avram goes, asks an inappropriate question. It's the same thing with, why did Moshe strike the rock? And therefore, it was decreed he can't go into the promised land. Because the Jews in the 40th year in the desert, we had failed with the Baal Peor, which was the most intense impurity of idolatry. This is where they defecated on the idol and they engaged with the daughters of Moab. That idol, it says, where is Moshe's burial place? Opposite Baal Peor, opposite that deity. Because every year that deity ascends from the ground and brings about a level of prosecution which cannot be counted. Because Moshe's grave is there, opposite. When it sees Moshe's grave, immediately goes right back into the ground. That sounds as the prosecution. So, but why did Moshe go into the promised land? He struck the rock. But why did he strike the rock? Why did God give him this challenge that he knew he would fail? Because Moshe had to be buried opposite Baal Peor. So all the events of the Torah, every one of them, it's always to address, to be the counterforce for all the various evils that exist in the world, different levels of representation, which have to be vaporized and purged and expunged from existence, because ultimately, at the end of time, what has to happen? God will be the supreme, only king. Nothing is outside of him. The Amalekites will be removed. They'll be obliterated from under the heavens. But who does that? It's the Jewish people. So all these various events had to happen for us to address all these issues, which will bring the world to ultimately to perfection. Okay? So Avram said, ask the question. Your children are destined to go into land which is not theirs. They will be enslaved. They will be afflicted. They'll go out with great wealth. Okay? Now, the choicest, most special of all the patriarchs was Yaakov. He fathered the 12 tribes. Now, we read a story. Yaakov had a very, very special son, Yosef, who was his son born to him in his old age. He was his 11th son. He was Ben Zekunim, and he was favored. He was the most special. He loved him more than all the sons because he was the wisest. He appeared as him. He had all his abilities. And he favored him, but he made a mistake. What was the mistake? He bought him a Ksonis Pasim. He bought him this extra garment, which indicated he favored Yosef over his other sons. And then Yosef begins tailbearing. And there becomes a level of strife between them, not to be understood. Yaakov is hearing all the tailbearing that Yosef is bringing to his father. Yaakov himself dismisses it as childish. But the brothers believe that Yosef's intention is to what? To discredit his brothers and ultimately destroy them. And because of that, they've decided they have to remove him. So let's listen to the scenario goes on here. Yosef is sold into slavery, goes to Egypt. Now, why does all this background have to happen? Because Yaakov had to go to Egypt. Yaakov being the personification of Torah, being the most special of the patriarchs. Does God want Yaakov to go to Egypt in shackles? Be inappropriate. Here you have a person at this level. He should be taken to Egypt in shackles. It's literally a desecration of God's name. He represents Torah. That's the way he's taken to Egypt. And why would he have to be taken in shackles? Because what does Egypt represent? A level of evil. Yaakov doesn't want to be exposed to that. But what happens? Because of all the strife between Yosef and his brothers, Yosef is sold to Egypt. After 22 years, he finds out that he's the viceroy of Egypt. He's in Egypt. What does Yaakov say? I'm going to Egypt to die, to see my son before I die. And Yaakov understood. When he goes, he will not come back alive. He will pass away in Egypt. So, and when he comes to Egypt, what was the level of glory and respect and honor and reverence he was given? In the history of the world, there was never such reverence given to an individual. Because when Yosef, the viceroy, came out to greet his father, all the Egyptians came to give honor to Yaakov. Yaakov was seen as that special person. So rather than going to Egypt in disgrace, Yaakov went with the greatest level of honor and glory. So why was the story of Yosef and his brothers orchestrated? So Yaakov should not go in disgrace. Yaakov had to go to Egypt. Now, many things happened. Yaakov sees, when he first sees Rachel, who was the main two of the matriarchs. She was the primary matriarch. She was the mother of Yosef, Binyamin, and Benjamin. Now, when he saw her, it says he kissed her and he cried. Why did he cry? So the Midrash tells us he cried because he immediately saw that Rachel will not be buried with him in the tomb of Machpelah. That's why he cried. He understood she can't be buried. Now, why was he not buried? Why was she not buried in the tomb of Machpelah? Because Rachel had made a mistake. But that mistake, again, her father was an idolater. When they left after 20 years, the home of her father, she took the fetishes of her father and she hid them in the camel, in the saddle of the camel. Lavan comes and pursues Yaakov. He wants to kill him. Finally he realizes that he can't kill him because God came to him in a dream. Says, do not touch him because you will regret it. You will die if you do. But he says to Yaakov, but why did you have to take my fetishes? He says, whoever took it should die. Yaakov was unaware that Rachel took them. And because of that curse, Rachel died. But why did he make that mistake? Because Rachel had to be buried on the way to Hebron, on the way to Beis Lechem. Because when the Jews go into exile, which God, of course, foresaw and knew, and spent 70 years, when they pass by her grave, she will come out and supplicate God that her children should return to their boundaries. Kol barab and nishma. And what does God say? V'shavu banu l'gulam. Your children will return to their borders. After so much time, they're all coming back. So Rachel had to be buried there. They had to be buried there. So Rachel made the mistake by taking her father's fetishes, because she wanted to wean him from idolatry. But he's a bad guy. He's going to be an idolater in either case. What difference does it make? She felt she's doing a good deed for her father. But because she did that, Yaakov made a mistake. And he cursed the one who took it, because he believed it was impossible any of his family could have taken it, not knowing it was Rachel. Rachel now dies as a young woman. She's buried on the way to be the one to, when the Jews go into exile, she should go supplicate God to guarantee the Jews shall return. Now, Yaakov was meant to live 180 years. He lived only 147 years. Now, why? One of the reasons why he did not live 180 years, because he said, whoever took the fetishes, lo yichya. The numerical value of lo yichya is that difference of years. And those were the years he had deducted, because he caused Rachel to die before her time when he said lo yichya. Therefore, he had those years, 33 years deducted from his life. Now, Rachel had to be on the way. Now, Yaakov dying 33 years before his time. You realize, if he would have lived another 33 years, that means the bondage of Egypt would have been delayed 33 years. Because it says that the only reason why that impurity started to seep into the Jewish people was only because Yaakov passed away. So if Yaakov would have lived another 33 years, what would have been? The Jewish people would have been a different level of dimension of spirituality. Yaakov, as a result of Yosef being sold into slavery, Yaakov was denied prophecy for 22 years because he grieved, believing that Yosef had died. Now, if Yaakov would have prophesied for an additional 22 years, Yaakov would have been a different level of spirituality. He would have prophesied another 22 years of his life. He would have been a different dimension of person. His level of influence would have been another level. So if you figure those years and the 33 years that he would have lived in Egypt, we would have talked about we'd be a different Jewish people. So why aren't we? You know why? Because God says you're going to be what you're supposed to be. You have to contend with all the issues and all the challenges, all the struggles in the context of where you are. Somebody once said to the Chazon Ish, who was the leading Torah sage, from after the war till he passed away in the early 50s in Israel, they said to him, if we would have a Chafetz Chaim living in our times, we'd be a different Jewish people. His level of influence on the world, on the Jewish people, would have been different. So he said, every generation has its challenges because you're not supposed to have the Chafetz Chaim. The reason why we don't have a Chafetz Chaim is because at our own level, we have to deal with our challenges. And we have the ability to deal with those challenges. And the results of that are going to be special because we don't have a Chafetz Chaim. So it's not if we would, you have the wherewithal to deal with every challenge that each generation is challenged with. Why? Because only God knows why you have to have that level of challenge. And if you succeed, then it has greater value than having a Chafetz Chaim. But again, it's only because God knows. So every one of these scenarios, Yaakov now prophesying 22 years when he believed Yosef was not alive. That he had 33 years taken from his life because he made a mistake, but he said the one who has those fetishes should not live. Rachel had to pass away early because she had to be buried on the way. So when the Jews go into exile, she should come out of her grave and supplicate God to guarantee the return of the Jews from exile, from the Babylonian exile. So we see, and now, because the 10 sons of Yaakov sold Yosef into slavery, we had a story of the 10 martyrs at the time of the Romans. The Roman emperor killed Rabbi Akiva and all his colleagues, who were the greatest Torah sages from Sinai till that time, to atone for the sin of selling Yosef into slavery. You understand what this is? This is all as a result of all these mistakes. They're not mistakes. Every one of these incidences, it's not happenstance. They're put in place, and all these mistakes have to be made because ultimately to achieve the end result, which is God's glory, the perfection of the world, where the world will be worthy of God's presence. And Edom, the Edomites, will be destroyed. All these various events which had to take place was only to bring about the end result. So these are not mistakes. It's a setup, but it's not a setup. It's your choice. No, the question I always ask, which I say is not a question, but if you really don't get it, people think it's an impossible question. If God knows the future, or God is in the future, where does it leave choice for us? Where does it leave choice for us? Right? Very common question asked. Free choices, we have the choice to do right or wrong. But if God knows that we fail, or we're going to fail, where does that leave choice for us? So Alan heard this answer many times from me, and so did Bob. But I'm not going to put it to the people to say it over because they may not say it right. And if they say it in my name, I always say, if you say what I said, I'm happy. But if you don't say what I say in my name, then I prefer to say it myself. Okay. So what I always say is, let's say you have a person that you know he has certain weaknesses. And you create a scenario where you know he will fail. But the person doesn't definitely have to fail. But because the person has a certain issue with certain things, he has the ability to control himself. But because you know the nature of that person, the person will probably fail. Okay? And it's called entrapment. Entrapment. When you entrap a person and the person fails, the person failed because he chose to fail. Although you knew he was going to fail. But was it that person's choice to fail? The person had the ability not to fail. That God knows the future and sees our choices, which may have been we failed, but why did we fail? Because God caused us to fail. Or because God is in the future and he already saw that we failed. So because God knows every nuance of existence from the beginning till the end, he orchestrates certain events because those events are crucial and basic and essential for the world to evolve in a certain way to achieve that level of perfection at the end of the day. But it has no bearing on our choice. We had the choice. Avram did not have to ask that question. Yaakov did not have to make the mistake he made by favoring Yosef over his other children. The brothers did not have to sell Yosef into slavery. It was their misreading of the talebearing. Rather than attribute it to immaturity, they believed he's plotting to destroy them. So every one of these evaluations were these oversights, these blind spots, it's attributed to the person's own failing. But God presented those blind spots because they were necessary that the person should make a choice to fail, because ultimately it's for the best interest of existence till the end of time. That's the understanding. I had once said over a beautiful allegory from the Vilna Gaon, and I had said over, somebody shared it with me when I told him something I'd seen in the Ramchal. The Ramchal, Rabbi Lutzato, writes that when we say Gamzu Latova, it's for the best. Like the stories the Gemara tells over about Nochem Ish Gamzu, the story with the earth, and how anything that ever happened to his life, it was the most serious moment or dire moment. He says Gamzu Latova, it's for the best. And it always turned out to be the best. But, because we don't see the end of the day, therefore, we don't see why it's for the best. But it's for the best. Now, let's say, a person goes and he wants a certain position, and somebody else gets the position, he doesn't get the position. You say, Gamzu Latova. But in your lifetime, you don't see why it was for your best. See, that's based on pure faith. I trust God, it's for the best. What about you truly see that if you would have had that position, ultimately, your life would have been destroyed? And you see it. So you say, thank God I did get that position. So in your own lifetime, you see it's for the best. The Gemara tells over a story based on a verse in Tehillim that we find that a person is upset with God to the point he blasphemes God, God forbid. And afterwards he sings God's praises. What's the story? A person has a buying trip and he's going to catch a boat, a ship, to go on a buying trip. and his wagon breaks its axle on the way to the harbor, and he misses the boat. Here, his whole future financial standing is gone because he doesn't want that trip. He's out of business. He's upset with God. I'm this devout Jew. Why are you doing this to me? And the people went out. They went out with great fanfare, so on and so forth. A few weeks passed. Word comes back. The ship sunk at sea. Went down at sea. The man is singing God's praises. First, he's cursing God because he didn't make the ship. And now we sing God's praises. Thank God. I always say with the Titanic, the level of envy that people maybe could have afforded to be on that ship, people of status, and they weren't able. They felt disgraced. They're shamed. They felt they couldn't find a hole to bury themselves in. With their wealth, they shouldn't be on the Titanic. Little did they know, when they realized what happened, they said, thank God we weren't on the Titanic. We don't need that glory. Okay, that's called fantasy. That's not reality. You don't want that. That's Gamzu Latova. So in your own lifetime, you see the blessing of not having Gamzu Latova. So Ramchal says that's not the real understanding of Gamzu Latova. It's not it. Gamzu Latova means you have a span of existence, 6,000 years, the first moment to the last moment. Each event in that moment, each frame is positive, although it may look negative, or it may look positive and it is negative. Every event is a frame in existence that ultimately, to be able to arrive at the end of existence with the world itself, achieves a level of perfection. So even though on your personal life, your personal situation, you see it as for the best, but that's not really the best. It's like an employee lands a job and things are terrific, and it's for the best, turns out to be one of a kind. But you realize you may be a beneficiary, but ultimately it's the best interest of the company that you're there. It has nothing to do with it. And that outshines endless times over what is you in your personal best interest. So what you see to be for the best, you're missing the point. It's infinitesimal in terms of reality of what truly is for the best. That's the Ramchal. So the Vilna Gaon explains it with an allegory. There are different qualities of gold. You remember the allegory when I say it over. There's a gold called Zav Paz, Pei Zayin. 1 ounce of this gold, its value is endless times value of ordinary gold. It's the rarest gold. We don't have it today. And there was a king who wanted that his royal garment should be made of this gold. And he was the wealthiest king in the world. And he sent out emissaries throughout the world to just buy up this gold because there wasn't enough of it. To purchase it, to create his garment. So before he went to send out his emissaries to locate this gold, he calls in his tailor and he says, how much gold do you think I would need for this royal garment? And I want to be magnificent, and I'm not holding back. Whatever the cost is, I'm happy to pay. So he told me you need a certain amount of this gold. And I said, an ounce of this gold was worth, an ounce may be worth 1,000 of ordinary gold. Finally comes back, they come back with the gold. So the king says to this tailor, how long do you think it'll take us for you? How long would it take for you to make this garment? He says, I think it'll take about 3 years. He says, fine. Takes the measurements. They turn the gold into thread, the special gold. After 3 years, the king comes for a fitting, puts on this royal garment, and the king was a smart man. And he looks in the mirror and he nearly passes out. He's never seen anything so magnificent. What his presence, his aura, something is magnificent. Never saw anything like it. And he says to the tailor, you're one of a kind of a person. In terms of your craft, your expertise, nobody is like you. But you know something? In 5 minutes, you went to the gallows. So the tailor was taken aback. He said, here you praise me, now you tell me you take me to the gallows. He says, according to my understanding, the gold that you asked me to accumulate and to purchase I don't see all that gold in this garment. It's not all there. It's clear you embezzled some of that gold. And therefore, you deserve to be put to death for that. So that you, this expert tailor, you created this for me, has nothing to do with you being a thief. Therefore, being a thief, you will be put to death. So the tailor comes to his own defense. He says, Master, Your Majesty, why are you accusing me? He says, because the way I understand it, I don't see the gold. And even a small amount of that gold is worth a king's fortune, a king's ransom. You're a thief. He says, unfortunately, I'm going to have to prove to you that every ounce of gold or iota of gold that you purchased is in this garment. But to prove that, he starts explaining it. He says, you realize you have certain creases and folds in the garment. All that takes up enormous amount of gold. So you don't visually, you don't see all the gold. But to be able to create what I created, you need that amount of gold. He says, I don't believe it. He says, I'm going to prove it to you. What I'm going to have to do is the 3 years worth of work that I created this garment, I'm going to take apart the garment down to the thread that was created. I have to unravel that garment back to the original thread, and then you will see that every ounce of gold, every iota of gold is there in this garment. So the Vilna Gaon says, after 6,000 years, we say, Kishem Shvorchan al Tov Kach Morchan al Ra, as one acknowledges God for good fortune, one has to acknowledge God for tragedy, because God is Dayan Ha'emes, He's the true judge. But where do we see it? You see a Holocaust, Dayan Ha'emes. You see people suffering, Dayan Ha'emes. How do you understand it? How do we can't wrap our heads around it, no matter what. Even if it should be explained, we don't have the capacity to understand how it works. At the end of time, you know what God will do? He's going to present all existence from the first moment to the last moment. And by seeing all existence in one moment, you will see how this is the ultimate good. That even this tragic event, because of that, it brought about the greatest level of blessing and perfection, which couldn't have happened unless that happened. But you have to see the full picture to see exactly why it's not ugly and something and the pain is worth it. I mean, just to give you an inkling of the idea, even to relate to it. Person goes, and to make his fortune, which he'll be able to support 1,000 generations of his descendants, to live with luxury, lavishly, in comfort. He has to spend 20 years in the diamond mine, lacerating his hands and having black lung, suffering from all kinds of ailments. But at the end of the day, what did that all bring about? Enough wealth and blessing that 1,000 generations of his descendants are able to benefit from that. Is that tragic? That's the ultimate opportunity. Person's offered to be the chairman of the board of General Motors. You work a 9-to-5 job. Not a big deal. You're home. You offer the position. You're on call. You have to have it in mind. You have a responsibility. As long as you're in that position, you have no day, you have no night. He says, look, you know something? It's a curse. It's a curse. People would be envious, would get anything to have that job, to have that position. Because if you understand what it means to head General Motors and run such a corporation, it's the ultimate. Unless you have no interest in anything. But if a person who has interest in, understands what the value, he doesn't see that as a curse. So it's the perspective, it's where you're coming from. But you have to work so hard. It doesn't make a difference. For what I'm able to accomplish versus the economy, versus my family, versus many things, and when I retire, what my value will be as a consultant, everything else, something, it's worth it. It's beyond worth it. But you have to really see the full picture to appreciate what that is, regardless of how hard it may be. So how painful something may be, even for the individual, but versus the total picture, this is the greatest level of blessing. I'll give you an example. When you're exposed, Mr. Glick told me, he made pieces of jewelry that were worth $20-30 million. Not only was in diamonds, he had jewelers who worked in his office. And he had a factory in his office. They would produce these necklaces who were worth $20-30 million. Big diamonds. But the reason why he could make these diamonds, these necklaces, because he appreciated every diamond, what it was, and how one diamond fits to the other, to create this magnificent necklace. But sometimes you needed small diamonds, so the small diamond doesn't have its value by itself. But if you add that small diamond to the necklace, it brings the necklace to another level of value. You understand? But you have to have the ability to own the larger diamonds, and you have to have the eye to understand how that smaller diamond complements the other. So if you have the small diamond, it doesn't have its value. But for him, he could buy it at a much less level of value because that person doesn't have the larger diamonds. But when you take that small diamond, put it with the big diamonds, you create this magnificent diamond necklace. That small diamond takes on a different level of value. So does anybody understand anything? So if you're that expert jeweler who have all the various components to create that, then you begin appreciating what value is. It's the same thing in life. Who understands anything? I just said in this last week's reading, Larry asked me, how's my Shabbos? It says that the Torah tells us that Yisro, the father of Moshe, he went out into the desert so Rashi cites, but we knew the Jews were in the desert. Torah has to tell us that he went out to the desert. We know the Jews were, since there's no, to speak the praiseworthiness of Yisro, that he gave up all his glory to go out into the desert. Okay? That's praiseworthiness. Now, why did Yisro leave all his glory to go into the desert? Why? So this is the example I give. Person can buy a $500 million property for $5 million. And he has to take $1 million loan and pay 100% interest until he purchases it. And it's going to cost him that $5 million, it's going to cost him $50 million. So somebody says, are you out of your mind? That kind of interest. Whoever heard? And you have nothing. He says, it's okay. He says, because if you understand what I'm going to be doing with that, what's cost me 50, my return, I'm going to have a $50 billion piece of property, a $500 million piece of property. It's pennies. Yisro had an understanding of what Torah was and what it meant to be part of the Jewish people, what God was, what means not only be a monotheist, but the ultimate level. Giving up what he had is like a person says, you liquidate your home, all your assets to purchase something which is endlessly more valuable than that. Is that praiseworthiness? Or he's a smart guy? That's being smart. Because Yisro had that appreciation. What is he giving up? He's giving up nothing for everything. It's only the bystander who doesn't understand it. They say, no, this is something special. He's really sacrificing for God. Giving up all that glory for this, that's praiseworthy. But for him personally, it's not praiseworthy. It's an easy one. Because the degree that he appreciates what that is, he's giving up nothing. He's giving up nothing for everything. So what's the praiseworthiness? So what's the praiseworthiness of Yisro? That he saw in that context that he's giving up nothing for everything. That's the praiseworthiness. Not that he went out to the desert. Going out into the desert only tells us his internalization of the reality of what Yisro valued. That's what it's all about. Rav Shach once said, Zechat Tzarech Levrocha, Rav Shach lived till 107 years old. And he said, and he was the Rishiv of Ponovich in Bnei Brak, and he said, no person who walks the face of the earth has the level of pleasure he has in the physical life. The man didn't have much. He had his svarim, his books, he had his students, but he says, the level I have pleasure, the richest man who walks the face of the earth does not have the pleasure I have. So they looked at him like he's crazy. This guy has a yacht. He has everything, servants, homes. There's nothing that is denied to this person. And he has his health. Nobody has the pleasure I have of this existence. So they asked him, what is it? He says, when I studied the Rambam, and I have a difficulty, and I work on it, and I'm pained, and I don't sleep or eat to try to figure out what the Rambam is saying. And afterwards I have the understanding, and my eyes are illuminated, and I understand what Rambam is saying, The pleasure I have from that, there's nothing equal in existence to that moment of pleasure. Somebody else looks at me like the guy's crazy. If you do know it, you don't know it, doesn't really make a difference. But in terms of where he was coming from, being the Torah sage he was, not knowing that, what was the level of that he felt he's being denied? To what degree did he have to afflict himself to come upon it? You have to be him to understand what that is. So the way he internalized it and the reality, nobody could have that level of pleasure as he had. Regardless how much material you have. It's a whole different reality. Everything is perspective. Everything is who are you. You find a person's a hedonist. He walks into a room. These people, they used to go on these cruises, right? Before they had, Legionnaire's disease and that every kind of, whatever it is, virus on these ships. What was the track to these people? They would give them a rate. You can eat all you want and drink from morning till night. And when you came back, you had to take off 40 pounds. Alan, these are Alan's patients, right? The people, they lived for that cruise. Could you imagine any type of food, any cuisine, it's there for you. So the person who's that person, he's excited. Somebody else who doesn't value that, they say, no, something, I don't want to go near it. It turns my stomach. It's nauseating, this behavior. It's totally unacceptable. These people, they don't live like civilized human beings. They put their head in the trough and they don't take it out till the boat docks. And they have ambulances waiting at the dock to take them to the hospital, and they've had to put them on a respirator because they have Legionnaire's disease or some other kind of virus. It's the same thing. I'm giving the most absurd, ludicrous example, but that's the same thing. Rav Shach, Lahavdil, between all these other people, it's a different, you're coming from a different vantage point. What is this and what is this? And how does he internalize it? The first time I met Louis Glick was many years ago. I was in a hotel for Pesach. It was called the Granite Hotel. Story goes back maybe 43, 44 years ago. I was asked to say a shir in this hotel for Pesach, a shir. Just give you a little background. I was the guest of my parents. I wasn't a paid person to say. Came as a guest, and they called me. They heard I was coming, and they said, would you say the shir? Would you say the shir? I said, you provide the books, I'll say the shir. The majority of the people who were there at this hotel came from 5 towns. So it was a very upper crowd, in terms of affluent crowd. And this is 44 years ago. Most of these people had learned in yeshiva when they were younger. This crowd, many of them. Mr. Glick, Louis Glick was there. So this, my father, originally when they asked me, says, it was a shir between Mincha and Ma'ariv. There was a break, an hour. So my father says, what are you wasting your time? I was studying Kollel in Baltimore. So what are you wasting your time? Maybe it's like a bunch of stragglers come in, 9, 10 people, you give the shir. And then a few other people come right before and they listen a little bit. You're wasting your time. I said, Dad, people ask me to say it, I'll say the shir. Whatever happens, happens. By the end of that Pesach, I had 200 people coming to that shir. This is the story. One of the people was Louis Glick. So I said, there's a very difficult question which Rashba answers. Rashba is one of the early commentators, and it's really a difficult question. And people, they toil to figure it out. And some of them, people don't sleep nights because they're working on how to figure out this Rashba. So Mr. Glick, with his humor, says, I'd have no problem sleeping. That was his comment. I would have no problem sleeping with such a question. Okay, but that was his humor. Because of that shir, that's why I came to New York. When I met Louis Glick at that Pesach, he says, you're my man, I want you in New York. And he asked me to come to New York, just to give you the background what it was. He says, what do you mean you can't sleep? And you have a question? There's an expression in Yiddish, "Mishtap nicht von der Kasha." One doesn't die because you have a question. You go on. It's not the end of the world. But again, everything's the way you process things. Everything's your orientation. Orientation. You have a certain orientation, you appreciate something. You don't have that orientation, you just gloss over it. It means nothing. The book of Bereshis, the Sefer Bereshis, which is the first of the 5 Chumashim, 5 books of Moses, as they call it, is referred to as Sefer HaYoshar. It's the book of the straight ones, the people who saw it straight. And the Gemara says, why they called Yoshar? Because the patriarchs were called Yesharim. They had an understanding of reality that nobody had their understanding. And what's it mostly speak about? Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. That's what it speaks about. It speaks about creation. But primarily, what does the Sefer speak about? The involvement of the Jewish people. That's what it speaks about. And how does it end? The Jews go to Egypt. Yosef dies. That's the book of Bereshis. That's the book of creation. The second book, Shmos, is the book of redemption. Now we begin understanding the objective of creation. Who are the patriarchs? They laid the foundation. For the people who will be the ones who stand at Sinai and let this last week's reading to receive the Torah, to become God's chosen people. That's what it's about. So why is this book such an important book? And I mentioned in the past, years ago, when I used to teach Chumash to women, or even to men, what I used to begin with, Lech Lecha. That's the portion of Avram Avinu. Go from the land that I will show, whatever it is, and he leaves. That was the test. The average Jew, who's totally has no background, how does he see Avram Avinu? He fed the homeless. He had a soup kitchen. That was Avram Avinu. He was a kind man. He was a man. He was a little eccentric. He did his things. He did crazy things. But bottom line, he was a terrific man because he provided food for humanity. No, Bill Gates creates sanitation in Africa. Avram in Mesopotamia and Canaan, he provided food. He set up these hospitality centers. That's what Avram Avinu was. He was a creative hospitality centers. He proceeded to what's his name? Whatever, Garden Inn and this one, all the holiday, they have all these inns. That's what he did. He was the one. He was God's representation on earth. That's what he was. But how do we appreciate who we are? By understanding who Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov were. When you appreciate who they were, then we know what our DNA is. We have a DNA which doesn't exist by any other people who ever walked the face of this earth. And we have that DNA because we are the descendants of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, the patriarchs. So it's important to study that book and to understand every nuance of these people's lives, because only then do you appreciate. I'll give you an example. Person is an elementary school dropout because he didn't have parents, he was orphaned. And somebody who understands what potential meets this 12-year-old kid. And he begins speaking to him. He says, you know something? Whatever it costs to educate you, to give you a crash course in terms of to make you literate, understanding, I will pay for that because I appreciate your potential. Because you have the potential to eventually go into medicine and discover things which will change the world due to your ability. Because I appreciate what your potential is. If you understand what every potential of every Jew is, you have to study who Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov were. Who are they? And who they are, that tells us what the potential of every one of us is. That each one of us could make a difference to change this world. One Jew. Saving a Jew, the Talmud tells us, is like saving a whole world. That's what it is. How could it be? Because what one Jew was able to generate through his spirituality can make a difference on a global level. But who appreciates that? How's that possible? 8.5 billion people. 13 million Jews. One Jew is more than the 8.5 billion. How's that possible? Because if you understand what a Jew is able to generate in the spiritual realm, there's nothing comparable to that. But who has an appreciation for that? Who even has an inkling of that? What does it mean? Unless you have an understanding. Where Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov were, you have an understanding. There's a thought just came to me this morning while I was saying the Amidah, the Shemon Esrei. We say, Elokei Avram, Elokei Yitzchak, Yaakov. Then we say, Zocheh Chazdei Avos. God remembers the kindness of the patriarchs. Could you imagine that? Since they passed away, it's over 4,000 years ago. We're still living, we're still drawing on their account. Could you imagine? These three people lived, overlap one another, how many years? Avram passed away at the age of 175. He had Yitzchak at the age of 100. Yitzchak had Yaakov at the age of 160. At the age of 60. Yaakov passed away at the age of 147. So we're talking about 250 years overlapping between the three of them. 300 years. They generated enough merit in their lives to cover the Jewish people to the end of time. Zocheh Chazdei Avos. How's it possible? That all the kindness which the Avos generated in their short life, relative speaking, to thousands, number of millennia, is covering the debt. And therefore God keeps us going. And when will he bring Goel? Or maybe Goel of Nevi'im. When that expires, when that's exhausted, Mashiach is coming. But how could people generate so much debt? Now, we read in Pirkei Avos, through 10 generations from Adam to Noach. The people were evil, he destroyed the world. Through 10 generations from Noach to Avram, and God kept the world going. And it says, Avram kibel schar keneged chulam. Avram received the reward of the 10 generations. Even though they were evil, he received their reward. Why did he receive their reward? What did he do? So Rabbeinu Yonah in his commentary on Pirkei Avos explains, why was the world destroyed? Although Noach was a tzaddik and he was so special, why did the world survive? And with Avram, although they were just as evil, the world did survive. So now, there's an expression in the vernacular, picking up the slack. God says this world is only worthwhile if there's a certain level of achievement, a certain degree of perfection is brought about. You got to infuse in this existence positive value. Noah couldn't make up the difference. God says it's not worth it. It's not worth my while. As much as Noah was a tzaddik, he couldn't generate enough merit to compensate for what they were lacking. Avram was a whole different dimension. He was able, in his lifetime, although he lived 175 years, he was able to generate enough spirituality, which was the equivalent of all 10 generations, that if they would have done the right thing, he generated what they would have done. Therefore, he is meritorious and deserving of what they all would have been worthy of. Could you imagine? One person, whatever 10 generations were, and they weren't ordinary people, because if they would have achieved the right thing, it would have been something beyond our understanding. He, as one individual, could actually compensate for all 10 generations. And then you have Yitzchak. Then you have Yaakov, which is most special. So we don't even have an ability to make an evaluation of what that level of contribution was, what they're able to generate spiritually speaking. To be able to survive Lavan, despite every reason not to survive. In Lavan, God Targ Mitzvah Shamarti. I sojourn with Lavan. I meticulously kept the 613 precepts. I did not learn from his ways. I came back unscathed. Who ever heard of such a thing? What is that worth? And because of that, he was able to father a Jewish people. As if he was not in that environment. How's it possible? Therefore, Zocheh Chazdei Avos. One Jew, his value is 8.5 billion people. Although gross product, we could drown in the saliva of the world. We're not talking about the physicality, the physical value. We're talking qualitative, not quantitative. Therefore, to study the book of Bereshis and have a little bit of an inkling of what they were, they will appreciate what our potential is. And as a result of that, we will make better choices rather than worse choices. Okay, we're going to stop here today. Alan, good to see you.
Shkach, Rabbi. Likewise. Shvua Tov.
Shvua Tov, a good v'och, as they say. That's the way they used to say it in the old country. A gute Woche. Okay. Everybody be well. Take
See
care.
you at 11.
11 o'clock, Daf Yomi, yes. You be well. Take care.